Well, good afternoon and welcome to MedTech Crossroads. We're glad that you're here. Like we said in the little blurb earlier, there's only 2 more shows until Thanksgiving. Can't believe that this year has gone by so fast and so slow at the same time. We've got a great show today. In just a little bit, we're going to have Dr. Phillip Levy from Wayne State University on to talk all about the latest COVID news. We're looking forward to that and to your questions as a part of that. But before that, I want to welcome our friend Tom Marten on from the U of M Coulter Program. He is with us today. Tom, you can make your mic and your video live. Hey, Tom, how's it going?
Good, Gene. How are you today?
Good. Before we get into all the COVID news, which we're going to do here in just a second, I know that the Coulter program is partnering with Johnson & Johnson on a JLABS event, and we're actually going to have Rachel Rath on the show in a few weeks. But I think this would be great for you to pop in and tell us about what you guys have happening over at Coulter.
Sure. So this is it's a J&J innovation webinar coming up that I thought would be of interest to a lot of the folks on a call. This is really designed more applicable for academic innovators who are looking at medical device concepts they've developed within a university, saying, where do I go with this? And what's that road to an exit, so to speak, whether it could be direct license to an existing company or forming a startup. They put a nice panel together. I was flattered they included me on this, but I think it's more important that for us to hear from folks around the country. MIT is going to be on, hear folks from JLABS, Ethicon, also Catalyst Ventures. And we actually taped this on November 3rd and the 19th, they're going to play it and then have live Q&A at the end. So just wanted to let people know about it. If you're interested, it's a free webinar to call into.
That's great, Tom. So you want to make contact with Tom, with the folks from Johnson & Johnson, with the folks from MIT. And the Q&A is going to be live, so that the session was recorded, but the Q&A will actually be live with the same people who were on it.
Yes, they taped it during election day and realized that probably wasn't the best day to hold a webinar.
Well, very good. That's great. And hope everything else is going well for you guys at Coulter. Any other news we should be aware about or show up on the 19th? I guess we should ask, how do we register for that?
There's a link. If you want to share the link, there's a direct link. You can just register online.
Great. We'll do that. We'll pop it in the chat. And everything else going well for everybody at Coulter?
Going well. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us today. We appreciate it.
Sure.
Well, as we have every week for the last few weeks, before we bring our guest on, we wanted to do the bit of COVID Connect news, and we're going to be talking all day today about the state of COVID in Michigan. So we're just going to update a few slides that you see here every week. The first is the U.S. hospitalizations, which we've always found to be a very meaningful slide, and you can see that the current number of hospitalizations in the U.S. beats either the Northeast peak that happened in the spring or the southern peak that happened in the summer. It's above both of those right now. The news in Michigan is, as you see here, things continue to climb. Hospitalizations are climbing back towards their spring peak. And that's, I think we'll hear from Dr. Levy. My understanding, and Dr. Levy can confirm this later, is that we may not even be hospitalizing as many people as we would have with better treatments and stuff like that. So the fact that this number is going so high is a pretty meaningful number. The last slide, one that we often look at, each one of these numbers has in general climbed at least a little bit since last week. This is the statewide PPE and hospital tracking site, and so most of these continue to go up as well. So having touched on that news, I want to welcome our guest today, Dr. Phillip Levy. Dr. Levy, welcome to the show.
Gene, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I wish we didn't have to continue doing this, to be quite honest with you. And those numbers you show are so sobering and scary, to be honest. While we're above the total number of cases, highest total number of cases that we've ever had, we're starting to get back to those hospitalization rates going up, and death rates are starting to climb. I mean, everyone who's listening in and has probably seen this pattern, but the cases start to climb, the hospitalizations follow, and the deaths follow right behind that. And we are all in the medical profession quite I think it's a mix of anger and fear and sadness and all of these emotions that go around the fact that we just can't seem to get ahead of this.
Yeah, no, very much. And we're going to get into some of these details. I want our audience to get their questions together to ask, because Dr. Levy is going to be taking questions at the end. But before we go into the details, I just want to give a little bio here. Dr. Levy is a professor at Wayne State University School of Medicine. He's an associate chair for research in the Department of Emergency Medicine. He's a fellow of the American College of Emergency Physicians and the American Heart Association. He serves as a reviewer for the NIH CHAS study section. He's a member of the Grants Advisory Panel for the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan Foundation and a member of the Scientific Review Committee for the American College of Emergency Physicians. He's also a recognized expert in cardiovascular research and has served on the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute's working group on management of acute heart failure in the emergency department. And the list goes on, Dr. Levy. I think it really is interesting because we all thought at first this was something that was just a respiratory disease, and now there's all sorts of different details that we could probably go into to learn more. But I think it would be appropriate to start with, where are we in Michigan today? You see things in some of the frequently hardest hit counties in the state. Can you give us an update on where the state is?
I mean, the state's in a bad place. We're getting to the point now, as we said, where hospitalization rates are starting to really climb, and you can't go into any community without seeing rising COVID rates. You didn't initially mention it, but the reason I'm even on here talking to you as a cardiovascular researcher is because early on, we at Wayne State started doing testing for healthcare workers and first responders, and then quickly morphed, recognizing the community patterns of illness that we were seeing, to do community outreach-based testing, and actually worked with the Ford Motor Company to develop a drive-to program where we found communities based on geographic distribution that were hardest hit, and we moved into those communities to do testing. And as part of that, we started to really try to understand how we can provide outlet to populations that are marginalized, populations that can't get tested, and populations that have a confluence of social and economic circumstances that make them more vulnerable to the infection and its consequences. As everyone on this call knows, one of the things that the state of Michigan did early on was form a task force to address disparities related to this. And a good thing is the disparities have now been largely closed in what we're seeing. In the beginning, it was far more disproportionate cases amongst the African-American community, especially in and around Detroit. And death rates were much higher. I think we all recall the data that you probably spent a lot of time talking about in the beginning. That's balanced out now. And what we're really seeing is the suburban sites and the less racially distinct communities starting to get higher and higher caseloads. In Warren, we're seeing the city hall have to get shut down. The police department is getting pretty hard hit. And so anybody who thinks that this is a virus that only affects certain populations and certain people are sorely wrong. One of the actually, even though we don't have a huge, First Nation population here in the in Michigan, we do have a reasonable number in Paw Paw in that area, and it's the First Nation Native American community that's actually bearing the brunt of the infection right now. Some of the highest case rates we're seeing are in those communities. But we also know that just by population density, what you highlighted there, Region 2 South and North, which are where I am located, where you're kind of on the border of it right there. Those are the areas with the highest population density, and it's the population density that's going to drive more cases. When you're in rural areas, people who are not living near each other, it's easy to space out. When you're in closer quarters, it's more challenging. So I think all the signs and signals are pointing to us needing to do something perhaps more drastic. We are seeing schools starting to shut down. Detroit Public Schools just shut back down. The school where I send my children, Roper, just announced on Monday, a little bit by my guidance, but it announced on Monday that they're going to be going to online only as well. And I think this is the trend that we're going to see heading into the holidays. And that's really scary as well, because who doesn't want to be with family for Thanksgiving? Who doesn't want to share in the festivities? But as we do that, we're risking the potential of taking COVID and just spreading it rampant amongst our households. So I would say the short answer is we're nowhere where we want to be. and the numbers just keep getting worse. And you're hearing inklings from the governor about what might be happening, what might be happening from her direction, and Dr. Khaldun in terms of how fearful everyone is about what's going on. So I wish I could paint a rosier picture.
No, it's one of the reasons we've got you on, so people can ask these questions and talk through this, and we appreciate that greatly. One of the things that we presented last week was a graph of the state of Michigan put out by the University of Michigan. They have a COVID mapping project, and I apologize I don't have that up here, but as we talk about that across the state, resurgence, and it's everywhere. We're seeing a resurgence everywhere. If you look at the biggest number of cases now that we're doing hopefully enough testing. In April, we weren't doing anywhere near enough testing. You're seeing it all over the place. The biggest resurgence of cases is in the southeast part of the state. But of course, there's more people in the southeast part of the state. And if you look at a cases per 100,000, it's actually the west side of the state that's lighting up like a Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Do you have any insight into that aspect? Are we seeing any lower hit in places that had been affected before? Do you feel that it's the same everywhere? Do you have any insight into that aspect? It seems like we do have a big West Michigan spike on a per capita basis, but a big spike East Michigan on just an absolute basis.
Yeah, I mean, it's so variable. If I can show you something real quick here, Gene, this is some of the mapping work that we do to help with deployment of our vehicles, and I can show you just how challenged the whole environment is right now. Hang on one second, let me just pull this up. And so the data that we use, hopefully everybody can see this graphic right here. When we look to deploy our vehicles, this one shows an overlay. This is Detroit area, Southeast Michigan. And what we try to track is the percent change in cases over time. And on a week-by-week basis. And the reason that we really want to be able to do this is because we want to put vehicles out and we want to be able to capture the cases where we can as quickly as possible. So this is 2 weeks ago, right? This is, or almost 3 weeks ago, October 26th to November 2nd. And you can see Southwest Detroit and that area was a hotspot. Hamtramck and Highland Park were starting to pick up, but not quite. And then you flip to 1 week later, and all of a sudden Hamtramck's a hot spot, as is the east side of Detroit. That southwest side of Detroit still has a high caseload. But what you're seeing here is numbers increasing by 30%, 25, 30% from week to week basis. And with all of this, it's just so hard to get ahead. It's so hard for us to keep up pace with this. And so, yeah, we're seeing cases spiking in the Grand Rapids area and all on the west side of the state. And why that might be, I think certainly some politics. We're not here to talk about that right now, but I think no matter where you are in your political spectrum, there is a personal responsibility that comes in when you see these numbers to realize that you have a role to play in preventing the infection. And, we're seeing new data from the CDC. Actually, just yesterday, they announced that mask wearing, yes, it does protect other people and it also protects you a little bit. And so we're starting to understand that as well. And whether people aren't wearing masks because they're fearful, because of their political reasons, or they don't understand the benefits of it, maybe this will help motivate some people to say, okay, well, if I don't care so much about protecting everyone else, maybe I'll care a little bit about protecting myself, because that's the name of the game here. We all are in this together. And so I just think that's it's just really unfortunate that this has been so politicized, to be honest. And it's really unfortunate that we can't have an honest truth about where things are going. It's horrible to see these case numbers. It's not a death sentence for everyone who gets it. So that's a little bit, extreme on one end. It's not the benign disease that others want you to believe. And a frank conversation on what the real circumstances are is what's been missing in this discourse.
I couldn't have said that better myself, and you're the one who should be saying it, and I applaud you for that, because when we stopped moving away from COVID Connect in I think it was June maybe, and our audience said, we're not getting a lot of honest truth other places. This has been such a wonderful place to get the truth about COVID. And of course, the summer was relatively quiet in terms of what's happening right now.
Wait, was there a summer? I don't even remember that, Gene.
I don't remember the summer, but now that this subject is well back up, I just really appreciate that perspective that you're bringing to it. Let's have an honest dialogue about it. And right now, I think the thing that that everyone had come together for at the very outset of this was the whole idea of flattening the curve. And
Mhm.
right now, I mean, one of the reasons we're bringing this back to the audience is because that curve is not flat. The numbers in the hospitals are going up. The numbers of ICU beds are going up. And it could be very critical very quickly here, and
You know,
may or may not be too late to do anything about it.
I would say too, it's not just the US, it's not just Michigan. You see this all over the world. And I think we don't want to destroy economies. We don't want to shut countries and communities and municipalities down. But at the same point, we have to realize that the consequences of not doing so are going to be probably far more impactful than if we all kind of figure out what we need to do to keep each other safe. And I do believe that we're going to have some governmental intervention at some point, and that's both for the protection of those uh, who keeping each other safe, as I've been saying, but also giving relief. And I'm not a politician, I'm not an economist or anything, but if we want to have people support the medical interventions, we have to make sure we take care of their businesses and the restaurants and all of these types of things. All of us want to be going out and we've been doing this for too long. We're cooped up in the house. We can't see our friends and our colleagues and all of that. And so the first opportunity people are seeking, they're doing that, but we have to do something so that it's going to be able to keep businesses alive and not destroy the economy, but at the same point in time, not destroy our humanity, because that's really what's at stake here. And I don't mean to sound so grave, but none of us ever seen anything like this in our lives, and hopefully we'll never see it again. But the staying power of this virus is just incredible. It's incredible.
I think we'll still be writing the stories about this for decades to come. And we're going to go on to the treatment aspect of this, but I just want to think about the regionality of it, the fact that, it's only now that West Michigan is lighting up, and yet this thing made its way all the way down into Texas, which blew up in the middle of the summer. Like, why that strange randomness? I think we'll be asking those questions for a long time to come.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is the return to schools and the interrelatedness that's occurring in those locations. Even though everybody's trying to do their best around that, I know that a bunch of the schools out in the Grand Rapids area, Kent County area, have really been hit kind of hard from all of this, and that plays into it as well. And I think it's been tough with all the rallies that have been going on and going to the polls and voting and all of these things that just this recent period of our country, of our time, has really just created the circumstances for the easy spread of the virus.
Yeah, no, we're definitely seeing it there. And I think on a bright side, there is a bright side to this. In all of this, there is a bright side. And the bright side, I think, is the work that all of you in the healthcare system have done. All of our frontline healthcare workers we heard the horror stories in the spring when no one knew what was going on. People wearing N95s for 3 weeks straight, just all this crazy stuff going on. One of the things that I think is pretty clear is that the healthcare system has, and doctors like yourself, have gotten a better handle on what this is and done some pretty amazing things. The fact that the death rate is as low as it is right now, I've heard many anecdotes that trace that back to many treatments that you guys have been able to identify over the course of this summer. I wonder if we could go back to the disease itself. When this all started, we thought, well, this is a respiratory disease. And then we heard things like, well, it's actually more of an inflammatory disease. What is this disease as best we know today?
Well, it's all of that and more, right? It enters the body through the respiratory tract primarily, right? That's the source that it gets in, and then it hits certain receptors in the lung, and it gets pulled into the cells in the lung, and then it spreads around the body from that mechanism. Those receptors here, I can show a quick picture of this again. We'll have Gene's face right there for a second, but the way it works, you can see this here. The virus attaches to what's called the ACE2 receptor, which is located throughout the lungs, the angiotensin converting enzyme 2 receptor, and then it gets intake. It enters the cell by fusing with the cell membrane and pulling into the cell, and then it starts to do its replication pathway. But what happens with all of that is that it imparts a tremendous inflammatory response, as we know, and that inflammatory response may mimic the way it's trying to attack the virus, may mimic certain components of the body and start to attack that. It may produce just an overwhelming inflammatory response that causes damage to blood vessels. It can cause damage to heart tissue. It can cause damage to nerves and the blood vessels feeding those nerves. It can cause kidney damage. But really, a lot of this seems to be flowing through this cardiovascular pathway. And what we're really learning is that a huge number of people who come in with COVID are going to end up having consequences in their cardiovascular system that are potentially lasting. I mean, we've seen stories of athletes getting COVID and then getting echocardiograms and finding out they've had heart muscle damage from this. I don't think we exactly know why a certain person may have a predilection for one organ system for another, but what we do know is that for people who are on the margins of function status, right? So somebody who's had longstanding high blood pressure, that has taken some injury to their kidneys over time or their heart muscle over time, the superimposed effect of the virus on top of that can lead to a rapid deterioration of function, and that functional deterioration is something that can last a very long time. And we're now starting to really understand that COVID is not just an acute condition, it's a chronic medical condition. I saw something published just this morning where about 1 out of every 10 people who is admitted with COVID ends up getting readmitted for a secondary COVID complication down the road. And, as we're talking, again, not to politicize the conversation, as we're talking about pre-existing conditions and all of that, we just added another 10 million people in this country with a pre-existing condition, and that condition is COVID. Because we're starting to really recognize that the post-COVID syndrome for some people may even be worse than what they suffered with during the acute infectious period.
Wow.
And that's very scary.
It really is this multifaceted thing that you can't constrain to one domain. Sounds like it transmits through the blood, but it's primarily received through the respiratory system.
Yeah, once it gets into the respiratory system, it starts to replicate and then moves all around the body. And where it settles and where there is damage already in place, it wreaks havoc.
That's very interesting. And you told us a little bit here about the long-term effects. What sorts of things are you finding from a treatment perspective? Maybe you could compare and contrast between the treatment that was the initial gut reaction in the springtime versus where it is today. I know I was talking to a relative of mine who works in a hospital system, and they were saying we would have these people walking in and their pulse ox would be through the floor, and it's time to intubate them, obviously, and we'd have to tell them get off their cell phones. Well, you never have to tell somebody with a low pulse ox to get off their cell phone. They usually are flat on their back. So right. There are all these weird things going on. I know that the initial reactions weren't always the correct ones, but can you compare and contrast where we are today versus the things we've learned and where our guts were in the spring?
Yeah, absolutely. When people first started getting ill with this and really ill, again, this was more the older individuals in the very beginning and individuals with those chronic medical conditions and chronic debilities that make them more susceptible to all of this. But where we started, we treated it like every other severe infection that we know. You come in and you're having a hard time breathing, we put you on a ventilator. But then we realized early on that the normal ventilator settings that we use and the normal way we approach ventilators doesn't seem to fit the pattern here, because you have people who have low oxygenation yet aren't in what we would call florid edema. They don't have wet lungs full of fluid or anything like that, even though some will develop that. They're heading in that direction. And if you intubate them too early, it might be causing more lung damage, which then produces worse outcomes. We're also starting to realize that for some of these individuals, the low oxygen saturation wasn't necessarily a consequence of the lungs themselves not working right. It was coagulation in the blood vessels and what we would normally think of as pulmonary embolism or other things that cause blockage of the blood vessels and prevent gas exchange. That's that type of stuff that started to occur. So once we got a little bit of a better understanding and handle on how to manage the respiratory approaches, that was one certain thing. But then we also stopped, fortunately, with the kitchen sink approach, because we didn't know what we were doing, so we did everything. That's when you saw the initial treatments with azithromycin and hydroxychloroquine. That all started with just a couple of papers outside of the US, in France and other places, where people said, yeah, we tried this and it seemed to work. And then all of a sudden we're buying millions of doses of this, and people are taking this when they get exposed. And, some people are developing cardiac consequences of this. And Finally, just actually a couple days ago, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the definitive articles on hydroxychloroquine came out, and randomized controlled trials showed absolutely no benefit. And we saw the FDA make an about face when they initially approved it under emergency use authorization, and then reversed that and said, no, people really shouldn't be taking this. So I think we also got to the point where we started to better understand the therapeutic milieu for this and what doesn't work, and got those things out. We started to recognize early on that steroids may be beneficial because they calm down that whole inflammatory pathway. And very quickly, dexamethasone emerged as the treatment that you want to give to the vast majority of moderate to severely ill COVID patients, because it's going to keep them alive, or at least it's going to reduce the likelihood of having those adverse consequences. But now we're in a very new landscape. We started to see things like remdesivir, which I'm sure everybody's heard of, which received emergency use authorization in late October. And then you have to figure out who the right population is for that, because now that we have the right therapies, or at least we have some therapies that can provide benefit, we can't give them to everybody because not everyone's going to benefit. And so we're starting to also understand that personalized and sort of tailored approach to this. And just a couple days ago, on November 9th, we had the monoclonal antibodies approved as well. So now we have a new group of agents that are potentially beneficial, not for hospitalized patients, as remdesivir is intended to be used, but this one is for people with mild to moderate symptoms who don't necessarily require hospitalization, to try to prevent them from getting far worse and requiring hospitalization. I think just the general concept too of hospitalization, and the hospital being the place that you go when you're severely ill or moderately ill, we flip that a little bit too, because the hospital isn't always the best place to be, as paradoxical as that might sound, if you don't have that severe illness, because there's a lot of other ththings going on. And if we can reduce the likelihood of developing secondary bacterial infections or hospital acquired infections or whatever it might be, the nutritional status of people in the hospital, all of these things that play a role in your recovery aren't always the best in the hospital. And sometimes you're better off being at home and being in your comfort zone and being around people who, actually not really being around anybody, but, being in a place where, you can achieve the things you want to achieve to stay well, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you're not always looking to be in that high treatment area, because there's other acquired things that can go along with it. And I'm going to ask this question carefully, because I think we have to preface this by saying, if you have symptoms or something, go see your doctor, go to the emergency room, go get the help. But and I think we got to caveat this, and you can caveat it however you'd like. Can you give us an idea of how you triage COVID patients at this point in time? Who's going to get sent home? Who's going to get this kind of treatment? Who's going to get that kind of treatment? As much as you can say about that.
Yeah. So, age is obviously a very, very important factor in this. We know people older than 65 with comorbidities especially are the most vulnerable to this. And so anything that says there's a deterioration from baseline for this individual, because of COVID, that's somebody who really is not going to do well, because they will spiral worse, if they don't get proper round the clock treatment like we can provide in the hospital. So that's an important one. Some of this too is looking at the numbers, like you said. You're looking at blood pressure, you're looking at heart rate, you're looking at oxygenation is probably the most important variable. Things like temperature are not things that we're going to make decisions on per se. Just because you have a fever of 102 or 104, that's a fever, as any fever is, but it doesn't make you more sick. It's just how your body manifests its reaction to an illness. So we don't look at somebody's temperature as the barometer or the thermometer, for why they would come into the hospital. But we look at all the other factors. And what is most important from our perspective is, do you have clear evidence of consequences, physiologic consequences from this? And that may sound a little bit silly, but having a fever, having a cough, having a runny nose, having a sore throat, having muscle aches, losing your sense of smell, those are all things that people will develop symptoms, but they're not necessarily hard end physiologic consequences like kidney dysfunction that's worsening, or cardiac dysfunction that we can see, or evidence of myocardial injury that we can detect with lab tests. And so what we try to do is get the tests that we know can help us uncover that below the surface indicator of consequences, what we would call target organ damage or vital organ damage consequences.
Wow, that makes a lot of sense. You're not, I think what I hear you saying is you're not trying to just treat the symptoms, you're trying to treat the things and focus in on the things where you're watching the body system deteriorate and often in a way that needs to be stopped if it won't stop on its own.
Yeah, exactly.
Take us to the world of what everyone's hoping for. So many people say, I don't want to leave my house until there's a vaccine. And I think those of us in the world of MedTech know that these processes can take a long time. There can be lots of hiccups along the way.
Mm-hmm.
We saw stops and restarts in many of the major vaccine trials. Good news recently. But what can we expect here, and what are we seeing on the ground? What are some realistic expectations at this point?
So this is, so I want to preface this by saying we saw incredibly encouraging signals from the Pfizer trial. 90% of people seem to have, effective response to the vaccine, meaning they mounted an antibody response, and more important, they mount a neutralizing antibody response, meaning that it's not just antibodies that will mitigate the consequence of the infection. It can actually, wipe the infection out and help clear it from your body. But, I think it's important that we understand a couple of things. Everybody's going to respond a little bit differently to whatever, vaccine is given to them. Some are going to have a more, some are going to have a less robust immune response. And there are several different types of vaccines out there. Some are classic vaccines that look at a protein on the virus, and it tries to recapitulate exposure to that protein and then induce that antibody response. Some of them are looking at other ways that you can get the downstream protein production. The Moderna trial looking at microRNA and the like. We don't know what that's going to be, that particular thing, because we've never had a vaccine like that. And I think what's challenging here too is that what you want from the vaccine is not just the immediate trigger of an immune response. You want to make sure that it's producing lasting immunity and it's producing memory immunity, which it should, right? There's no reason why that wouldn't happen. But the question is the immunity that we're developing one that is going to merely prevent you from getting sick, but you may carry it for a day or two while the body mounts the response and fights the virus off? At that point, you might be an asymptomatic carrier yourself, and we may still be spreading the virus despite being vaccinated. We don't know that information. We don't know how long that immunity might last. Is it going to be lifelong, or is it going to be, as we've learned over time with measles and other things, where you have to go get your booster shot? It goes away over time. Is the virus going to be mutating and changing in a way that makes the vaccine itself less effective over time? It doesn't seem to be necessarily a quick mutator. It's not like HIV or other things that changes here and there, but there seem to be different strains of the virus. And is each strain going to be equally responsive to the vaccine? And are there vaccines that can induce a more broad immune response than a more narrow one? And one of the things that is challenging to conceptually understand is that we right now believe that people can get reinfected with COVID. However, if you were exposed to COVID, that's the most significant immune trigger you could possibly have. The vaccines themselves are based on the virus. And so they are variants of the virus that are being developed to trigger that immune response to recapitulate what's occurring naturally. Right. And so, in that sense, if we don't think having the virus is going to produce lasting protection going forward, how do we know that being vaccinated is going to produce lasting, protection going forward? That's a tough one, because we're not going to be in the position to have the luxury of time here. Because as soon as the vaccine vaccine signal shows it's going to be effective, as we saw with Pfizer, boy, everybody's going to want that, right? The whole world is waiting for this vaccine. But we don't know what the lasting effectiveness is going to be. And equally important, we don't know what the lasting safety is going to be, because people can develop long-term consequences for this. And some of the questions are, we're doing these trials around vaccines. And any trial to look at benefit versus harm is a placebo-controlled randomized trial. We have several different companies as part of Operation, Warp Speed, all working towards the same goal. But how do you handle people who are part of a trial when a new drug gets approved under EUA or a new vaccine gets approved? There's ethical issues abound, and it's going to be really difficult for us to really know that natural progression of the safety profile of these vaccines. We already have enough anti-vaxxers out there and enough people fearful of what vaccines do down the road, 10 years down the road. And so we're never going to have that data. And we do know that people are scared of the vaccine and people are fearful of everything going on because, again, of the politicization of this whole thing. There's a rush to get the vaccine for various reasons, right? The most important of which is keeping people safe and healthy. But the political side of it, too, is raising skepticism amongst people to say, are we cutting corners? Are we doing everything the way we normally would? And again, we just do not have the luxury of time. But I would say this, I'd much rather have a vaccine than not. And I'm really happy to see how quickly everything is moving forward. You can see things like what we're hearing out of Russia, where they went as fast as they could to develop a vaccine that doesn't seem to be doing very much. And it may even be harming some people. And that's just the information that it's going to be really tough to collect right now. And even if that occurs, until we know, like I said, that it's protective, this doesn't mean you get the vaccine and all of a sudden everyone takes off their masks and shares a beer again or whatever it is. Like, that's not where we're going with this. We're going to still have to practice safe, social distancing and wearing masks, because we just still don't know if it's going to be a completely neutralizing vaccine, or it's just going to be one that makes the individual who gets exposed have a less severe reaction and a quicker antibody response to prevent the virus from taking hold, or if it's going to be something that prevents you from getting infected at all. That's the
sort of prime the system, as it were. Do we know anything about secondary infections? I think your point about primary infection, or the first infection, not necessarily protecting you against the second, raising a little bit of question as to, okay, how is the vaccine going to work? But do we see that those secondary infections the second time around, do we see that they're less intense than the first time around?
Yes and no. I mean, there's a lot of anecdotal things here where, people will say, oh, somebody had it and then they came back, they got it a couple months later. And some of that is test characteristics. Some people may test early on, and we know that people can shed the virus for quite some time. I'm going to pull up a couple of other slides here, I think, which would be helpful. If you look here, this is the natural course of the virus, at least in terms of detection of it. And so you can see in the week and a half or so before symptom onset, when someone gets exposed, you start to detect the virus in the body, and then you start to mount the antibody response right here. You can see these two dotted lines, and the antibody response can take a little while to lag and then trail out there. But you can also see here that the virus can live inside your body for quite some time. And while it's living inside your body, it is still detectable. It might not be infectious, but the thing that we use to determine if you're infected is your COVID test, right? Your SARS-CoV-2 swab. And if you're positive potentially for up to months at a time, we don't know. You got better, you were sick, you got better, you tested positive. We presume you're okay, yet you come back a couple months later and you're still positive. And that's part of it too, is that there hasn't been clear guidance on when you repeat test and what indicates somebody who's got prolonged viral shedding versus somebody who's got a new infection. But I can tell you this, there are reports, just a handful right now, because there hasn't been a systematic analysis of this, but we've seen these in the news, right? Handful of reports about people who are swab positive, swab negative, and then got sick again with swab positive. Does that mean that one of those tests was a false negative? Could that be what's confusing the picture? Could it be that the person now just has, the COVID again, and that's the reason why they're symptomatic the second time? I think this is clear as mud, if you will, because we just don't know. And but I think all things point to the fact that people are susceptible to getting reinfected with the virus, and that is a scary prospect.
And this starts to go into some of the questions from our audience. We have some questions ahead of time from the audience, and I want to just take a pause here and ask the audience, if you got any questions, raise your hand, stick it in the Q&A. We'll try to get it to Dr. Levy before the end of the show. But I think you've answered one of the questions that we had here about mutations, that it is mutating, but maybe not that dramatically. There are strains. Maybe you can say a word about that. And then also we had a question about immunity, which you've also touched on just now. Uh, but what is the deal between T cells and antibodies and that whole back and forth that we've heard in the news? So I guess the two questions there. Another word about the intensity of the mutations or strains that we're seeing, and help us understand the difference between the T cell response and the antibody response.
Yeah, so I'll address the mutation portion first. So because there are other strains, or more than one strain of the virus, it's very clear that some mutation, some change has to be occurring to produce these new strains. We wouldn't have 7 or 8 different variants of the same virus come out of nowhere at one time. It starts with one and it modifies, but it doesn't seem to be a fast mutator. It doesn't seem to be something that is just constantly changing, yet still producing the same level of infectivity. The thing we know about coronaviruses, these are the common cold viruses, right? Every year people are exposed to coronaviruses and they do change rapidly, but a lot of that mutation, it ends up being cross species, right? So it can hide in one species and then get mixed with other variants of coronavirus and then be released in another way. And that's why we're seeing the culling of minks, right? In Finland, and some of you guys may have seen that, killing off animals that you would never think of as a reservoir for this, but here we're killing off a bunch of minks because it seems to have a predilection for living inside there. And the stories, anecdotally, we don't know the truth of this. Did this start with bats in China? And is that how it kind of came together? I think a lot of it, the likelihood of these mutations has a lot to do going forward with the cross interaction between different species with the virus, and that is probably the biggest thing that will lead to this. But to your point, it's not one of these things that's just spontaneously mutating in the free environment unless it gets intermingled with other variants of the virus. So, and then what I wanted to do here is bring up just one more graphic, and I didn't want to do a death by PowerPoint, but I wanted to make sure you guys saw some of this. So this is a nice demonstration of what happens in the body with B cells and T cells and antibodies. And so this is similar a little bit to what I just showed you in the sense that, the infection, the exposure occurs early on and you get infected. And as we saw in this slide here, the immediate response to that infection is to trigger activation of your immune system. The immune system is a combination of B cells and T cells. The B cells produce antibodies. The T cells help recognize the foreign substance in your body. In this case, the corona, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. You start to build up your antibodies, but the key for all of this is that you build up antibodies early to help fight off the infection, and then they linger for a little while to help prevent potentially reinfection, but they'll all go away. So the antibodies naturally go away and they disappear around 50 days or so after the initial peak. And so you can see here on the bottom, this time frame. And so plasma blasts are the B cells that come out immediately after the infection, and they start to produce the antibody. So if you look right here and you see this area that says plasma blast expansion, that is the beginning of B cells that are triggered as soon as the virus comes in. You have T cells and two different types, but it doesn't matter for this conversation. But T cells, which help trigger the B cells to start to recognize the virus and produce antibodies. And then those will go away because when you're no longer acutely infected by the virus, you don't need them anymore to help you fight off the virus. But what your body wants to do is make sure if you're ever re-exposed again to the virus, you are ready to fight it off. And that's where the memory cells come in. And so memory B cells are the ones that start to develop and provide lasting immunity. And so what you can see here is that even though we detect the antibodies and they start to come out within a week or two after the exposure, they peak by about 50 days or so and then start to wane off, it doesn't mean you lose protection. It just means that you don't have that protection readily available in your system. It has to be triggered. And that's where you see this anamnestic response to reinfection or the vaccination, which is basically a triggering of the immune system, which is coming over time because you have been previously exposed and your body knows that it needs to gear this up. And so that's the thing that we also don't know, right? Is we think that the protection period is going to be while you have the detectable antibodies in your system. But the reality is, with every single virus that anyone's ever exposed to, this reaction and this curve is the same. I mean, it may have little variations on there, but basically, all antibodies are going to wane over time after you've been exposed to a virus or bacteria, whatever it might be. And the way you maintain immunity going forward is by having these memory cells, which live in your bone marrow and live in lymph nodes and live in other places in the body, that then are ready to go. They're soldiers at the ready as soon as you're re-exposed. The minute that SARS-CoV-2 would enter into that the lung cell, the pneumocyte, through that receptor, that would trigger the production of the antibodies. And while
From the B cells that had the memory of it.
Exactly. And while it may take 7 days, a week in order to trigger it the first time you're exposed, the next time around it takes 1 to 2 days. And so you develop a much quicker response. And that's, again, the thing that I was saying, is that that's what you're trying to do with the vaccine, right? You're trying to get that lasting immunity. You want those first antibodies, and then you want to get that lasting immunity, because it's not just 3 to 6 months that we're at risk. It's going to be, for
it's coming back again and again. Yeah. We have a question that relates to what you just said. Someone asked, for those that were not able to get a COVID test in the spring, but are fairly certain they had COVID, is there any way to verify that? Difficult to get doctors to acknowledge pre-existing condition in that case. I'm going to link another question to that, which is, is it likely that the vaccine will trigger a memory B cell response? So that is part of the hope. Even if the vaccine doesn't stop you from getting it, part of the hope there is that it would at least give you the memory B cells to be able to know what to do with it better. Yeah.
Exactly. Memory B and T cells, which you have to have that immunity, the memory of immunity, in order for the vaccines to work. It's kind of like, again, when we were kids, right? And we got, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, and it's so many years before you might ever get exposed to it. But that's where it produces that lasting immunity, although it's sort of that age-old expression, right? If you don't use it, you lose it. And so you have to reprime the immune system over time, in particular if people have waning immunity due to chronic diseases like diabetes or what have you, or autoimmune disorders, or things like human immunodeficiency virus, HIV. Those are the types of things that can wipe out that ability to respond with the memory cells.
So in terms of our questioner's comment, and there's so many of us that, I think in February, what looks like COVID now, went through our family. But is there any way to know at this point? Is there any way to go back? It sounds like all this data would be gone inside of our bodies at this point, other than maybe the
you can actually you can see if the cells exist in your body, right? There's a way to look and see if those cells are available. If they're floating around in your circulatory system, there's ways that we can analyze. It's not a common test. And if you went to your doctor and said, I want you to look for memory T cells in my blood to see if I was exposed to COVID, SARS-CoV-2, they will tell you in all likelihood, that's not something we're going to do in my office. But you can do antibody testing. It's not unreasonable to get an antibody test. So when you look at the antibodies, there's two types that are available now, IgM and IgG. Ig stands for immunoglobulin, and IgM is an earlier phase antibody that comes up soon after the infection. What's a little funny about SARS-CoV-2 is it induces both IgM and IgG to start rising together early on. Normally, IgM rises first, and then IgG rises later. But with SARS-CoV-2, they seem to rise together. But that said, IgM will go away after a couple of weeks. IgG will likely persist. Even though it peaks at 50 days, it'll persist for 6, 7, 8 months. It may wane sooner in some individuals, but it'll peak, at that point, and then start to teeter down. So now that we're in November, for people who think they were exposed in February, having a negative IgG titer doesn't necessarily tell you that you weren't exposed. It just says you no longer have the antibodies.
They've waned off at this point. And
if you were exposed, it was likely months and months and months ago, not something that was relatively acute. So, and the other thing to say around all of this too is that it does seem that the strength of the immune response is related to the dose or inoculation of the virus that you're exposed to. And so we see a lot of these asymptomatic cases, asymptomatic carriers, and it's felt that the people who develop more symptoms are the ones who have a higher load of the virus, and those who develop a more profound immune response also had that higher load. And that's why it's so important when we look at who's symptomatic versus asymptomatic, because those who are symptomatic are much more likely to have that big hit of the virus, and they're the ones who are going to have a more robust immune response.
Right before we go to a live question here from our friend Ken Spencer, I want to follow up on one thing that some viewers had asked from a previous week when we were showing COVID data, and you would be the perfect person to answer this in relation to antibody testing versus PCR testing. We see numbers reported all the time, and many of us are familiar. Dr. Ing Pottinger from Columbia University came on the show back in March or April or May. And one of the things she impressed upon us was you really have to have multiple tests of different types before you really start to get a sense. One test could be a false positive, could be a false negative. So the picture becomes clearer over time. But more recently, our viewers have been asking, which types of tests are these? I think we have the impression that the tests we see reported in the news, let's just take the state of Michigan, those are all PCR tests at this point, or how do those tests get reported?
The lab reports them. So when you send, when I as a doctor send my test to a lab, the lab has the obligation to report to the state of Michigan the test results. Initially, they were only reporting test positives, which is typically the way you do things, right? You don't tell negative tests because, there's a lot of negative tests. But then we started to, really want to understand rates, and you can't do rates unless you know the denominator, and you got to have all tests. And so that changed. And so now tests are reported by the lab. It's their obligation, but it's only the tests that get into the lab. So the tests that are point of care. So all those things that we're talking about, those are PCR based tests. So when we see reported data, it's PCR based, or molecular tests, we'll call them. The antibody tests are not reported in the state numbers because nobody really knows how to use them. And that's part of the challenge, meaning that we don't know, this doesn't tell us our acute infectivity rate. And if I were to get a bunch of antibody tests on people and report them as positives, that would be misleading because it doesn't tell us where we're at today. It tells us where we were at months ago. So what I like to do in our testing scheme is I like to get antibody testing so I get a sense of how much a community was exposed in both the acute period and potentially the previous period. The other thing you can do is that if you have mounted that IgG antibody response, you're most likely not in an infectious point of your virus anymore because of that lag period. We know that after about 7-10 days or so, particularly in those who are no longer asymptomatic, they're probably not infective anymore. Even if they still test positive at 10-14 days, it's unlikely that they are shedding active virus. It's more likely that it's dead virus that is residual in their cells. So that's where I think the antibodies can be useful to kind of pull that together. But in and amongst themselves, they're not a good indicator of acute infection. They're more an indicator of what we call seroprevalence, which is, how many people in a given community might have been infected at some point in time.
Very good. We're going to let our friend Ken Spencer ask a question, and then after that, Deborah Livna looks like she has a question, and we'll make mics live for both of those. Ken, are you with us?
Yes, I am. And Dr. Levy, thank you so much. This is so much more in depth than any other thing that I've seen anywhere out there. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to move all the way back to a question on, actually I have a lot of questions, but I'll let the other people ask them first, but move all the way back to the state of Michigan.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing us moving or transporting patients from areas that have, not enough hospitalization, utilization or whatever to other hospitals like yours or U of M out there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the nice things that happened here is that everybody played really well in the sandbox together. And normally transferring patients, moving patients from facilities is a bit of a headache because there's a lot of things that go into that decision. But early on, facilities like U of M, Ann Arbor wasn't hit nearly as hard as we were in Southeast Michigan and Detroit area. They were very willing and ready and able to take patients on transfer to there. And I think that's the most important thing, that the state displays all the data on a regular basis. So you can look at the capacity across systems. So again, I'll show one more figure here. This is from the state data, which everybody can access. But you can see here you can go to michigan.gov and you can look at hospital health system patient census with COVID-19, ICU census, and total bed occupancy. And this type of information is so critical for us to handle the infection as a collective health system. But to your point, we're not seeing like in-migration to Michigan or other states from states that may have higher rates, but we might. As we look at places that are talking about Montana, for instance, right? Montana had no cases for a long time, or very few, and now they're talking about Montana running out of hospital beds, and so we're going to have to really think about this as a much more systematic approach to this. Meaning that one healthcare system where we all work together to make sure that we can meet the needs of the population.
I can
I hope that answered your question, Ken.
follow up. So in that transportation phase, how do you protect the EMTs or safety flight people and things like that? In addition to the patient, of course, but I mean, these other people are totally exposed.
Well, this is a very, I wouldn't say a funny thing, but there seems to be this tolerance, right? That healthcare workers are somehow protected because they have all their PPE on, and more extensive PPE than just wearing a mask. In fact, the guidance from the CDC is for healthcare workers who were in full PPE who are exposed are not considered an exposure the way you or I would be in the community. I'm sure all of us have known or been quarantined ourselves, right, for being around somebody who was positive, and boom, you're out for 14 days. Doesn't matter, what mask you were wearing. If you were within 6 feet for a cumulative 15 minutes for a 24-hour period, within 48 hours of that person's positive test, you're boom, you're in quarantine. But we don't do that with healthcare workers. In fact, South Dakota just announced that they want nurses and doctors to continue working, even if COVID positive, if they're asymptomatic. And so what you have there is you have limited resources. And so people are working and fighting through this. But the best we can do is give face shields, put on N95s, wear gowns, wear gloves, and do all that, the like. I mean, having full on contained units, the PAPR units, where your air is circulated internally through a tank and all of that. I mean, that's probably the only way to really ensure the greatest protection of healthcare workers. And I did see a statistic recently that 1 in 6 of every infection with COVID in this country was either in a healthcare worker or in somebody who was related to or in proximity to a healthcare worker. And, unlike a lot of other illnesses, this is destroying a lot of what we see in healthcare. And I think it's really a scary thing for providers, especially early on, who were intubating people without knowing any better how sick they could get from this. But I think the awareness of what we're at right now is probably the best thing that's happened, and making sure that we are all fully protected if we're going to be around these folks. But just keep in mind, if you're transferring a patient from one facility to another, or you're seeing the patient for the first time with suspected COVID, the protections that you need are going to be the same to minimize the risk of you getting infected.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thanks. Thank you, Ken. Deborah, I think you have the last question today. Wanted to make sure you got in here, and I saw it in the Q&A. It's a great question. So why don't you share your question with Dr. Levy?
So Dr. Levy, thank you for being such a champion of this. And we really rely on your knowledge and your expertise to help us deal with that. So I'm in Canada, and we're experiencing the second wave now, big wave of more people infected. I know other countries in the US, but also other countries, like many countries in Europe, in Israel, in Australia, they reported going back to lockdown and so forth. So the second wave is real. Yeah. And I just wonder, but we never hear about second wave in China. So my question, do you know if they have any secret sauce not to get infected, or they don't test? You probably know more than us, and maybe we can learn from it.
Well, it's, let's say this, less free societies like China, they have several different things. Number one, deviant behavior, if you want to call it that, is not acceptable in countries like that. And I'm not, saying anything about anything, but when the government says you don't do this in certain places, you don't do that. When the government says here, you shouldn't go to bars and restaurants, well, we're still going to bars and restaurants, right? And I think that's one piece of it. I think there is a very much sense of the collective in China. versus countries like ours where we talk about being a melting pot, but really, the expression is we're more of a tossed salad, right? We have a lot of different parts in the bowl that don't all meld together. And I think when you look at societies that are more sort of nationalistic in that sense, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean they take a collective perspective. You see different things that happen. Plus, China has been and is more able to be heavy-handed with their population in terms of directives and doing things that can enforce the directives, like jailing people who are non-compliant and doing those things. Those are types of things that we would never stand for in this country or in your country or in a lot of countries. And so I think what happened in Wuhan, as soon as the virus broke, they locked that city down. Nobody was allowed in, nobody was allowed out. You saw the videos of that, from people inside, and it was draconian. But what that did is it prevented the virus from taking a root as it did here. And I think that's a big part of it. Again, I'm not advocating for that as the right way, but it's certainly an effective way.
So would you say that if people wear the mask, keep a distance, and people in China go to work, right? But they find a way to go to work and maybe have air filtration, that would kind of protect us right here?
Airflow, air filtration, natural, just movement of air. So no stagnation is a very important one. And I'll give you guys a fresh, off the presses, although there are no presses, but a reality circumstance is something that we've been doing. So I recently served as the health safety supervisor for a movie being shot here in Detroit. And, not that these champagne problems are ones that we really need to worry about, but there was a movie being shot in Detroit where we had a whole cast of folks, a whole crew of people, actors who were unprotected on set and everything. And we created a way to insulate each group who was having interactions with each other. Everyone wore masks, and we tested more than 5,000. We did more than 5,000 tests, and only 5 were positive. And that everyone on set could not believe the power of wearing a mask and social distancing. And what I would stress every morning as I talk to the group is look around you, know who you're interacting with, minimize the amount of time you spend in close proximity to those individuals, and wear your mask. And if we do that, we can prevent this virus from spreading. Right. But, one of the things that's tough is, can we keep doing that forever? How long can we prevent the virus from spreading versus, just being free in society? I think the Sweden experiment of herd immunity is one that is challenged, right? We saw the death rate in Sweden markedly higher during COVID than it was in any previous year. But they had a freer approach to this, and now they still are dealing with a second wave and still dealing with lasting consequences of this. And so no matter what we do, that's really the challenge here. No matter what we do, it's an incredibly resilient problem that it's unfortunate that we can't get ahead of it. I wish I had the answer to tell you, but unfortunately, the best thing we can do is stay away from each other and take personal responsibility for the protection of each of us.
Deborah, thank you for the question.
Thanks, yeah.
Well, and before we go, Dr. Levy, I think we've talked about COVID, we've talked about social aspects, we've talked about the maturing of the healthcare system and all these things. At some level, a lot of this comes down to personal immunity as well. Is there anything that people can be doing or should be doing in terms of their own bodies? What can people do to strengthen their own immunity?
Well, exercise is always an important one. Eating well, making sure you're staying hydrated, all the usual things that we'll talk about. But I really do think a critical piece of this is the mental health side of this. We are seeing a large number of mental health consequences of this, people both getting anxiety and PTSD related to exposures and spiraling from that, people who may or may not be taking their medications, the lockdown and all of that. And the other piece of this is the substance abuse. We are now experiencing a huge surge in opioid overdoses related to this. And we had a big problem in Michigan for a long time, as every state did. But now, because of this, we're seeing a tremendous rise in drug use. And we know that people are starting to use substances. You're home all day long, right? What do you got to do, right? You might as well get high or do whatever you're doing. And that in itself is causing a huge problem. And so we're seeing deaths that are collateral to COVID, not directly related to it, but certainly indirectly related to it. So I think keeping yourself physically and mentally sharp is really going to be critical in all of this. There's a lot of helplines that are available, a lot of resources for that. But the most important thing is reach out. If people are feeling down, if people are not feeling I don't know, energetic or whatever it is, talk to somebody, because we don't want more of the collateral damage to occur.
Well, that's wonderful. Dr. Phillip Levy, Wayne State University, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate this. We appreciate the information. Like one of our callers said, such a deep dive. We don't often get this, so we appreciate it greatly. And as the future comes to the present, we would love to have you back on to tell us about any updates that are happening in the state and elsewhere.
Well, thank you, Gene, and thank you for everybody who stuck around for an extra 8 minutes here and took an hour and plus out of your day to listen to this. It's my pleasure to talk to you guys about this. It's also my misfortune to have to talk to you guys about this, but I'd be delighted to come back on, Gene, and delighted to work with you as always, like we've been doing for the last couple of years. So,
Dr. Phillip Levy, Wayne State University, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being with us today on MedTech Crossroads. We're looking forward to next Friday. I do want to mention this, and we'll mention it again next week. The day after Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year's, we're not going to have the show. But next week we will. Still one more week before Thanksgiving. Looking forward to having you on MedTech Crossroads next Friday at 2 p.m. Thanks again.